In this example, we've got this monorepo. We've got a handful of services and a handful of tools where the services might run like a web server or a worker, and the tools are just a binary that execute a task. And there's dependencies within this repo. So some service might depend on some tool and so on. And so we'll jump through and kind of look at how Dagger gets involved there. So in this super basic example of one of our tools, it just prints out our operating system and architecture. And if we look at this specific tool's build submodule, so in this example, like each of these parts of the monorepo will have their own build submodule that tells the rest of the repo how to build this particular part of the project, right? And this all happens within Dagger so that you can reuse this across your whole project and also use it just to build your one component as well. So in this one, we can see to build our super simple uname binary, we have this build function, and really all it does is grabs our host directory and passes it to this go build. And I'll jump over to that. But what this is showing is, we have a bunch of different Go projects within this monorepo. And so instead of redeclaring, our instructions for how our organization builds Go apps, we define that in one place, and that way our monorepo can share these utilities. So we look at this Go builds, then we grab that our Dagger client, and we grab a container from our Golang image that we've defined here, right? And then we step through and mount our given directory to the container, set some standard environment variables that this organization uses on all of its Go builds, and then actually executes its Go build. And we're going to send the result of that build, the directory from that container, back to wherever called it, right? So if I go back to the place that called it, now we've got this Go build, and we're sending back a container. And now in the case of like, we actually want to build this binary for our machine, here's kind of our entry point for all of these things in this project. So we're using Mage for this. So each of these Mage tasks relate to specific projects within our monorepo. So this Go uname one that we were just looking at, here's this Mage task for it. So this is the very top level, right? So we start by creating that Dagger client, and then we call that Go uname build that we were just looking at. So this is at the top level, I just want to get the build for this one project and then give it back to my host. So let's go ahead and run this. If I can find my terminal, here it is, Mage Go uname. And so that's the task that we're just looking at. And Mage will just look at that file and find all the tasks and actually run those similar to make, right? So if I run that, we'll see some Docker things happening, some cached stuff, and then it actually output that's Go uname to my host. So if I look, there's our Go uname right here, right? So it just built that, it just dropped it on my host, and now I can say Go uname, and look at that. So there's our super simple task. Now, in this monorepo, like I mentioned, we have some things that depend on each other. So one of our services here is this Python server. It's just like a web listener that you can hit over HTTP. And the build instructions for this, we have a few different tasks, right? So we can build, which basically drops that server in a Python image. But this pretend server actually depends on that tool that we just looked at. So whenever we build our Python server, it requires that Go tool to be present in the environment because it's part of our listener, right? So if I look at what this endpoint actually does, if you can read Python, when we hit the root endpoint, it actually runs Go uname and sends that back as the response. So it's probably a super detailed and a bit detached from Dagger, but when we look at the actual Dagger pieces here, right, in this thing where we're actually building our Python thing, we call over to the Go uname build that we just looked at, that individual task, and we grab the binary out of that directory, right? So remember, this passes back a Dagger directory that has those build results. So we're going to grab that binary out of it, and we're going to pass that over. And then when we look at the image thing, right, so that now we're getting in that build from this previous step, where we've got our server, we've got our Go uname in a directory here. So when we build an image, we take that directory in. The image for this is a Python base, and we're going to mount those build outputs for the requirements for that Python server. We're going to copy those to the container root fs from the mounted directory. We're going to set whatever environment variables this Python service needs to actually run its server, and we're going to set that entry point. So a bunch of things happen there, but let's actually run it and have a look. So if I say mage pi server push, so it's going to build that whole image with all those things in it, and then it's going to actually push that up to Docker Hub. So while it's running there, I'll pop back over and see the last thing we called was push, where it calls the image.publish, and our image here is this server image. This is on Docker Hub, and while this train's going by again, I'll mute and we can look at this beautiful output. All right, the train is gone, and now we're running our image. So it's listening at port 8000. So if I, over here, localhost 8000, we see that uname. So again, it's doing the OS and Arch of the environment it's running in, and this container that is running the service is Linux AMD 64. So to kind of benefit, or to demonstrate the benefits of using Dagger in this kind of example, let's go ahead and make a quick change to that Go uname. So if you can imagine the DAG of all those things that we just put together, you know, the dependency graph of actually having this Python server with a Python image that requires this Go build to do some things. Normally, if we were just to rebuild this, all those things would have to rebuild from scratch, right, with all their dependencies and so on. So now we've modified that uname to say hello demo before it outputs those things. And now let's run this server push again. And with Dagger, because of all those independent steps, part we actually have to rebuild is that last part. So we already had the Golang builder image. We just had to run that build again on that thing and then copy it back into that Python image. So all those steps, aside from the actual Go build of the one thing we changed, they're all cached. And so if I run this again with this new image that we pushed up, Docker run. So it's going to pull that down from Docker Hub. And then down here, once it's pulled down on my hotspot, we're going to curl that and check it out. So now we have that new thing, and like we barely saw anything happening in this build, right? Because everything was cached. But we did that one Go build, put that in the image, and everything else was already done, so we didn't have to repeat it. So yeah, that's the demo. This hello-monorepo is up on GitHub, so I can link it in the chat once I stop sharing.